The first thing they teach you in the diplomatic corps is this: never trust silence in a room built for war. I learned that lesson 12 years ago, fresh out of the academy, when I watched a seasoned ambassador misread the quiet of a warlord's tent. He took silence for peace. They found his body 3 days later, drained and hung from the city gates as a warning. Since then, I've made it my business to understand the language of unspoken things. The shift of weight in a chair, the deliberate pause before a signature, the absence of guards when there should be a battalion. Which is why, on the night of the autumn accords, when I walked into the heart chamber of Valdres Palace and saw Queen Seraphine sitting alone at that golden table, I knew immediately that everything I understood about power was about to be rewritten. No guards. Not a single one. The corridor behind me had been lined with her crimson guard, 7-foot warriors in black plate armor, each one a turned knight from the old wars, their eyes glowing that telltale amber that marked them as her personal creations. They'd watched me pass with the stillness of statues, their presence a reminder that I walked here only because she allowed it. But the moment I crossed the threshold into her private chambers, that protection vanished. The massive ironwood doors closed behind me with a whisper of finality, and I stood in a room with the most powerful vampire in the Western Kingdoms, completely unguarded, completely alone. She didn't even look up. Queen Seraphine sat at the right side of a table that could have seated 20, her posture perfect, her attention fixed on a scroll unfurled before her. Candlelight painted her skin in shades of cream and gold, highlighting the aristocratic lines of her face, the impossible smoothness of her complexion that came from 3 centuries of eternal youth. Her hair, thick, black, elaborately braided in the style of the old bloodlines, cascaded over her shoulders and down her back like a river of midnight. She wore a gown of ivory and gold that seemed to glow in the low light, cut in the ancient fashion with a deep neckline that spoke of confidence rather than seduction. Heavy jewelry adorned her throat and wrists, each piece marked with glyphs I recognized from pre-cataclysm texts. Wards against betrayal, symbols of unbreakable oath, the sigils of the first covenant. And her wings. God, her wings. They rose from her back in sweeping arcs of membranous darkness, easily 12 feet from tip to tip, folded now in a position of rest but radiating latent power. I'd seen paintings, of course. Every child in the borderlands grew up with images of the vampire queen in their history books. But paintings couldn't capture the way those wings seemed to drink the light, couldn't convey the subtle iridescence that shimmered along their edges, the sense that they could unfurl in an instant and fill the room with shadow. "Ambassador Thorne," she said, her voice low and melodious, still not looking at me. "You're precisely on time. I appreciate punctuality." I forced my legs to move, forced my training to override my instincts. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was a trap, that walking deeper into this room without protection was suicide. But I'd been chosen for this mission because I understood something my superiors didn't. Sometimes the greatest danger lies in showing fear. So I walked to the table and took the seat she'd indicated with a subtle gesture, directly beside her, not across from her. Another calculated choice. Sitting across would have suggested negotiation between equals, a formal dance of proposal and counterproposal. Sitting beside her transformed the dynamic entirely. It created the illusion of collaboration, of shared purpose. Or perhaps it created the reality of vulnerability. Hard to say. I set my leather case on the table, documents, treaties, the official seals of the Human Confederacy, and finally allowed myself to look at her fully. She was already looking back. Her eyes were the color of aged wine, deep crimson with flecks of gold, and they held an intelligence that made my mouth go dry. This wasn't the predatory gaze of a hunter eyeing prey. This was the assessment of a master strategist evaluating an unknown variable. She was reading me the way I'd been trained to read rooms, and I had the distinct impression that she was seeing far more than I wanted her to. "No guards," I said, because sometimes the only way to defuse tension is to acknowledge it directly. "That's unexpected." The corner of her mouth quirked, not quite a smile but close. "You sound disappointed, Ambassador. Were you hoping for a more dramatic entrance? Perhaps a show of force to remind you of your place?" "I was hoping for protocol," I replied carefully. This meeting was supposed to be observed by representatives from both sides. Witnesses to ensure that I don't kill you and start another war? She did smile now, and I saw the pointed tips of her canines. Not the exaggerated fangs of folklore, but subtle, dangerous, perfectly designed by evolution or dark magic to pierce flesh with minimal resistance. I assure you, if I wanted you dead, the presence of a few courtiers wouldn't stop me. And if I wanted war, I wouldn't need to murder a minor ambassador to start it. Minor ambassador. The words stung more than they should have. She wasn't wrong. I was young for this posting, barely 35, without the decades of experience that usually preceded an assignment like this. But I'd been chosen precisely because of my youth, because the Confederacy's council had decided that sending a seasoned diplomat would signal fear. Better to send someone expendable, someone whose death wouldn't represent a significant loss if this went badly. They just never said that part out loud. Then why? I asked, gesturing to the empty room. Why dismiss your guards? Why agree to meet like this? Seraphine leaned back in her chair, and her wings shifted with her, a rustle of darkness that made the candle flames waver. She studied me for a long moment, and I felt the weight of her 300-year-old gaze pressing against my defenses. Because, she said finally, what I'm about to propose cannot be overheard by those whose loyalty is to tradition rather than truth. Because the moment I speak these words aloud, everything changes, not just for you and me but for every human and vampire in the known world. And because, Ambassador Thorne, I need you to understand that what happens in this room tonight is not a negotiation between enemies. It is a conspiracy between survivors. The room seemed to grow colder. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of the palace, footsteps in corridors, the murmur of voices, the eternal machinery of court life. But in here, in this bubble of candlelight and shadow, there was only her voice and the sudden, terrible certainty that she was right. Everything was about to change. I opened my case with hands that I was proud to note barely trembled. Inside were the documents I'd been sent to present, terms for extending the uneasy peace, trade agreements, border adjustments. Standard diplomatic fare, carefully worded to give neither side too much advantage. I'd memorized every clause, prepared arguments for every possible objection. None of it mattered now. I could see that in her eyes. I received your council's proposals last week, Seraphine said, reaching out to tap one pale finger against my documents. Very thorough. Very careful. Very utterly inadequate to the reality we face. The council spent 6 months. The council spent 6 months pretending that we have 6 months. Her voice cut through mine like a blade through silk. We don't. The northern territories have already fallen. The blight is spreading faster than any of our projections predicted. In 2 years, 3 at most, it will reach the borderlands. In 5, it will consume everything south of the Iron Wall. And in 10, she trailed off, but she didn't need to finish. I'd read the same reports, seen the same maps with their spreading stains of red marking dead zones where neither human nor vampire could survive. The blight. The one threat that made our centuries-old war seem like a children's squabble. The council believes we have time to prepare separate defenses, I said, hearing the weakness in my own argument even as I spoke it. The mage towers in the south, your blood citadels in the north. Will fall separately, having never combined our strengths. Seraphine stood abruptly, and I felt the sheer presence of her fill the room. She moved to a window, her wings trailing behind her like a cloak of night. Beyond the glass, I could see the lights of Valdres City spreading out below the palace, thousands of lives, human and vampire both, going about their evening routines, completely unaware that their queen was plotting revolution. Ambassador Thorne, may I call you Marcus? The use of my first name sent a shock through me. Familiarity from a vampire queen. Another barrier broken, another rule discarded. Yes, your majesty. Marcus then. And when we're alone you may call me Seraphine. We're going to be spending a great deal of time together, and I find titles exhausting when I'm trying to prevent the apocalypse. She turned back to face me, and the candlelight caught her wings, making them seem to glow from within. I didn't dismiss my guards because I trust you. I dismissed them because what I'm about to propose would be considered treason by half my court and heresy by yours. But it's also the only path forward that doesn't end with both our civilizations choking on poisoned ash. She moved back to the table, but instead of sitting, she leaned forward, her hands pressed flat against the golden surface. Her face was inches from mine, and I could smell her, not the death scent I'd been taught to associate with vampires, but something like night-blooming flowers and old books and the ozone tang of thunderstorms. "I propose an unification," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not an alliance. Not a treaty. A true unification. Human and vampire working not as separate kingdoms with mutual interests, but as one civilization with one goal: survival. It will require your people to see us as something other than monsters. It will require my people to see yours as something other than food. It will require both of us to betray everything we've been taught about what is possible." I stared at her, my mind reeling. What she was proposing, it wasn't just politically impossible. It was conceptually impossible. Humans and vampires had been at war for 500 years, ever since the turning plague had transformed the old ruling class into creatures of the night. Our entire social structure was built on that separation, our religions defined by it, our laws structured around it. "The council would never agree," I managed. "The council doesn't have to agree. You do." She straightened, and her eyes bored into mine. "I've done my research on you, Marcus Thorne. You weren't the council's first choice for this mission. You weren't even their 10th. You were chosen because you're expendable, because your death wouldn't cause a scandal. But you were also chosen because you have a reputation for seeing problems others miss, for finding solutions in impossible situations. 3 years ago, you resolved the Thornhaven crisis by proposing a water-sharing agreement that every other diplomat said couldn't work. Last year, you prevented a war over mining rights by discovering that the contested territory was actually worthless to both sides. You don't think like other humans, Marcus. You think like someone who cares more about results than rules." She was right, and hearing her articulate it so clearly was deeply unsettling. I'd always been the odd one in the diplomatic corps, the one who asked uncomfortable questions, who suggested uncomfortable solutions. It had made me effective but never popular. "Even if I agreed," I said slowly, "even if I went back to the council with this proposal, they'd have me removed from my post. They'd send someone more conventional. Which is why you're not going back to the council. Not yet." Seraphine reached for one of the scrolls on the table, unrolling it to reveal a map I recognized: the Northern Territories, marked with the spreading contamination zones of the Blight. "In 3 days I'm traveling to the Blackstone Fortress to meet with my Northern lords. They're demanding action against the Blight, and they're not particularly interested in my plans for long-term survival. They want a show of strength, a military solution. I'm going to give them a different kind of strength, a human ambassador traveling with the Vampire Queen, demonstrating that the old rules no longer apply." "You want me to come with you? As what? A hostage? As a partner? As proof that what I'm proposing isn't madness?" She rolled up the map with precise movements. "The journey will take 2 weeks. During that time, you and I will work together to draft a real unification treaty, not the political theater in your case, but something that might actually save both our peoples. And when we return, we'll present it as a fait accompli. Not a proposal to be debated, but an accomplished fact to be accepted." It was insane. It was brilliant. It was almost certainly going to get me killed. I looked down at my documents, at the careful compromises and meaningless concessions I'd been authorized to offer. Then I looked at her, at the creature who was supposed to be my enemy, standing in a room with no guards, proposing a betrayal so profound it might be the only honest thing either of our governments had attempted in centuries. "If I agree," I said quietly, "there's no going back. For either of us." "No," Seraphine agreed. "There isn't. But tell me, Marcus, when you look at those reports about the Blight, when you see the projections of how fast it's spreading, do you really believe we have the luxury of going back?" I didn't. God help me, I didn't. I closed my document case with a soft click that seemed to echo through the chamber. When I looked up at her again, I knew my expression had changed. I could feel the shift happening inside me, the trained diplomat giving way to something rawer, more desperate, more honest. "I'll need access to your intelligence networks," I said. Real information, not the propaganda both our sides have been trading. I'll need to understand the true scope of the blight, the real capabilities of your forces and mine. And I'll need your word, your personal word, not a political promise, that if I do this, you're committed to seeing it through even if it costs you your throne. Something flickered in her wine-dark eyes. Respect maybe. Or recognition. You have all of that, she said. On one condition. Which is that you stop thinking of me as Vampire Queen and start thinking of me as Seraphine. Because if we're going to save the world together, Marcus, we can't do it as symbols. We have to do it as people. She extended her hand across the table, palm up, an ancient gesture of peace. Her skin was luminous in the candlelight, unmarked by age or sun, and I could see the faint tracery of veins beneath the surface, could imagine the blood moving through them. Blood that had once been human before the turning, before everything changed. I took her hand. It was cool but not cold, strong but not crushing. The contact sent a shock through me that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the simple, staggering reality of the moment. I was touching the Vampire Queen, and the world wasn't ending. Instead, it was beginning. 3 days, she said, her fingers tightening on mine. Be ready to leave at midnight. Bring only what you can carry and tell no one. Not your council, not your staff. If this leaks before we're ready, we'll have assassins from both sides trying to stop us. Romantic, I said, and was rewarded with a genuine laugh, a sound like wind chimes in the darkness. Oh, Marcus, she said, releasing my hand and turning toward the window again, her wings catching the light. If you think this is romantic, wait until we're fighting for our lives in the Blightlands. Then we'll see if you still have your sense of humor. She was right, of course. In 3 days everything would change. But in that moment, sitting beside a Vampire Queen in a room built for war, watching her silhouette against the city lights, I felt something I hadn't felt in years of diplomatic service. Hope. It was probably going to get me killed. But at least I'd die knowing I'd tried to do something that mattered. I should go, I said, standing and gathering my useless documents. If anyone realizes I was here alone with you for this long, they'll assume I was deciding whether to turn you or kill you. Which, for the record, I wasn't. You're far more useful as you are. She glanced back at me, and there was something playful in her expression now, something that reminded me that underneath the queenly composure, she'd been young once too. Though if you'd like to be turned for diplomatic purposes, we can discuss it. I'm told my venom is exquisite. I'll take your word for it, Your Majesty. Seraphine. Seraphine, I corrected, and the name felt strange and dangerous on my tongue. 3 days. Midnight. I'll be ready. I know you will be. You wouldn't have shaken my hand if you weren't committed. She moved to the door, and it opened at her approach, not by her hand but by some invisible command. The guards outside were exactly where I'd last seen them, as if they'd been frozen in time during our conversation. One more thing, Marcus. I paused in the doorway. Yes. Thank you. For being brave enough to see past what you were taught to fear. Not many humans could have done that. Not many Vampire Queens would have let them, I replied. She smiled, a real smile this time, showing those delicate fangs, and inclined her head in something that was almost a bow. Then the door closed between us and I was back in the corridor, surrounded by her crimson guard, my heart hammering in my chest and my mind already racing ahead to everything that needed to be done in the next 72 hours. I didn't know it then, but that moment, that handshake, that agreement made in a room without guards, was the beginning of the end of the old world. And the beginning of something new. 3 days later, I would ride out of the human territories beside a Vampire Queen, and we would not return as enemies. What we would return as, well, that was a story yet to be written. But it started there, in that golden room, with the absence of guards and the presence of trust. It started with everything changing. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the conversation, wouldn't stop analyzing every word, every gesture, searching for the trap I knew had to be there. Vampire Queens didn't make revolutionary proposals to junior ambassadors out of the goodness of their hearts. They didn't dismiss their guards and speak of conspiracies unless they had something to gain. But what? That was the question that kept me pacing my quarters until dawn, watching the sky lighten over Valdres City, trying to understand Seraphine's angle. My rooms in the diplomatic quarter were comfortable in the way that gilded cages are comfortable. Expensive furnishings, thick carpets, windows that overlooked the city but were barred with silver-inlaid iron that would burn any vampire who tried to enter. The human confederacy didn't take chances with the safety of its representatives, even the expendable ones. Especially the expendable ones, it would be bad form to lose us to random vampire attacks rather than carefully calculated political sacrifices. I found myself at the window as the sun broke over the eastern towers, painting the city in shades of rose and gold. Down in the streets, I could see the morning markets opening, humans and vampires moving in their separate but parallel rhythms. The daywalkers, vampires who'd learned to tolerate sunlight through centuries of exposure and pain, moved through the shaded arcades, conducting business in their slow, deliberate way. Humans kept to the sunny boulevards, going about their business with the forced normalcy of people who'd learned to live beside predators. Separate. Always separate. Even after decades of uneasy peace, even in a city that prided itself on being the model of vampire-human cooperation, we existed in parallel rather than together. Different spaces, different times, different rules. Could that really change? Could Seraphine and I, a queen and a minor ambassador, actually reshape 500 years of division? The rational part of me, the part trained in diplomatic realism, said no. Said I was being used, that this was some elaborate scheme I hadn't figured out yet, that I should report to the council immediately and let them handle it. But the part of me that had read those reports about the blight, that had seen the maps with their spreading red zones of death, that had done the math on how long we had before the borderlands fell, that part knew Seraphine was right. We didn't have time for careful diplomacy. We didn't have time for gradual change. We had maybe 3 years before the blight reached our territories. And then the only question would be whether we'd die separately or together. I was still standing at the window when someone knocked on my door, 3 sharp raps, official and impatient. I checked the silver mirror by the entrance, a security measure that revealed whether the visitor cast a reflection. Human faces stared back at me, Counselor Graves and 2 of his aide, their expressions grim. This was going to be unpleasant. I opened the door. Counselor. I wasn't expecting. A private meeting with the vampire queen, Graves interrupted, pushing past me into the room. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile decades ago. Alone. For nearly 2 hours. With no guards present. Would you care to explain what in hell's name you thought you were doing? So they knew. Of course they knew. The council probably had a dozen spies in the palace watching my every move. I'd been naive to think otherwise. I was doing my job, I said carefully, closing the door. The Queen requested a private audience and I accepted. It would have been diplomatic suicide to refuse. It would have been suicide to accept. Graves rounded on me, his face flushed. Do you have any idea how many protocols you violated? How many safety regulations you ignored? She could have killed you, Thorne. She could have turned you into one of her blood-bonded servants. She could have done any number of things to compromise our entire mission. She could have, I agreed. But she didn't. Instead, she made a proposal. That stopped him. His eyes narrowed. What kind of proposal? This was the moment. I could tell him the truth. About the unification, about the journey to Blackstone Fortress, about everything Seraphine had said. And if I did, the council would recall me immediately, send someone older and more cautious. And the opportunity would vanish. Or I could lie. Mislead. By time. I chose a middle path, something close enough to truth to be believable, far enough from it to protect what mattered. She wants to establish a joint task force to study the blight, I said. Shared research, combined resources. She believes the threat is more immediate than our current projections suggest, and she's willing to share her intelligence if we share ours. It wasn't exactly a lie. The unification would include all of that. I was just omitting the scale of what she'd proposed. Graves studied me for a long moment and I kept my expression neutral, professional. I'd been lying to superiors since the academy. Every good diplomat learned that skill early. The key was to believe your own fiction, at least while you were telling it. A task force, he said finally. That's actually reasonable. Surprisingly reasonable for a vampire proposal. I thought so too. Did she give specifics? Timelines? Terms? She's preparing a formal proposal. I'm scheduled to meet with her staff later this week to review preliminary details. Another half-truth. I would be meeting with her, just not her staff, and not in the way he imagined. Graves exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. All right, that's something we can work with. The council's been pushing for more Blight intelligence anyway. If we can get access to her Northern Scouts reports without giving up too much. He was already spinning scenarios, seeing political advantage. Good. Let him think this was a normal diplomatic maneuver. I'll keep you informed of developments, I said. You do that. And Thorne. He paused at the door. No more private meetings. I don't care if she asks nicely. From now on, you have witnesses present at all times. Understood. Understood, counselor. He left and I allowed myself to breathe again. 3 days. I had to maintain the fiction for 3 more days, then I'd be beyond the council's reach, riding north with Seraphine, and they'd have no choice but to accept the reality I presented them with. Or they'd have me executed for treason when I returned. Also a possibility. I spent the rest of that first day making careful preparations. I couldn't pack obviously, that would raise questions, but I could organize. I sorted through my documents, identifying which ones I'd need for the journey and which I could leave behind. I drafted a letter to the council, carefully worded to be opened only if I didn't return, explaining my actions and justifying the gamble I was taking. I reviewed maps of the Northern Territories, memorizing routes and fortifications, preparing for discussions I knew Seraphine and I would need to have on the road. And I thought about guards. About what it meant that she dismissed them. In vampire society, guards weren't just protection. They were proof of power, visible reminders of a ruler's strength. For Seraphine to send them away was to deliberately make herself vulnerable, to demonstrate that she trusted me enough to be alone with me. Or, more accurately, that she was confident enough in her own power that she didn't need guards to protect her from one human. Both interpretations were probably true. That was the thing about the Vampire Queen, she seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, every action carrying layers of meaning. The second day was harder. Graves wanted updates and I had to manufacture progress reports that sounded plausible. I invented meetings with minor functionaries, drafted preliminary agreements that I had no intention of ever presenting. It was exhausting, maintaining the facade while my mind was elsewhere, already on the road north, already imagining the conversation Seraphine and I would have. That evening, a letter arrived. No messenger, no fanfare, just a sealed envelope that appeared on my desk between heartbeats, placed there by someone or something that had moved too fast for human eyes to follow. The seal was Seraphine's personal mark, a crowned skull with wings. Inside, a single line in elegant script. The northern road is cold. Bring warm clothes and a strong constitution. We leave at moonrise, not midnight. The courtyard behind the Chapel of Sorrows. Come alone. Moonrise. I checked the almanac, that would be 2 hours earlier than midnight, around 10 o'clock. Another precaution, another layer of secrecy. She was being careful, which meant she was taking this as seriously as I was. The Chapel of Sorrows was in the old quarter of the palace, a structure that predated the vampire wars, when humans and the undead had worshipped different gods in different spaces. It had been abandoned for decades, considered too contaminated by old magics to be useful. Perfect place for a secret departure. I burned the letter in my fireplace and watched the paper curl into ash. No evidence. No trail. The third day crawled past with agonizing slowness. I went through the motions of my duties, attended a meaningless briefing about trade tariffs, reviewed documents I didn't care about. All the while, my packed bag sat hidden in my wardrobe, filled with the essentials Seraphine had suggested. Warm clothes, durable boots, basic supplies. I'd added a few items of my own, a knife with a silver blade, not because I expected to use it against her but because the Northern Territories were dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with politics. A journal for notes. A small leather case containing the seals and documents that proved my identity as a Confederacy ambassador. and a miniature portrait of my sister, painted 5 years ago before the consumption took her. I didn't usually carry it on missions, but something told me I'd need a reminder of why I was doing this. Why I was risking everything on a vampire queen's promise. Elena had believed in impossible things. She'd been a healer in the borderlands, treating humans and vampires both, convinced that medicine was medicine regardless of what kind of blood pumped through your veins. She died because of that conviction, contracted a variant of the blight while treating infected refugees, died slowly over 3 months while I watched helplessly from her bedside, unable to use any of my diplomatic skills to negotiate with disease. If she were alive, she would have told me to go with Seraphine. Would have called me a fool for hesitating even a moment. Elena had never been afraid of vampires, had never bought into the propaganda that painted them as nothing but monsters. She'd seen them as patients, as people, as survivors of their own tragedy. I like to think I carried some of her courage. It was probably arrogance, but it got me through that 3rd day. Moonrise came with a suddenness that caught me off guard. One moment I was watching the sun set from my window, the next I was checking my chronometer and realizing I had less than 20 minutes to reach the chapel. I grabbed my bag, paused at the door to take one last look at my quarters, comfortable cage that it was, and stepped out into the corridor. The diplomatic wing was quiet at this hour, most of the staff already gone to their evening meals. I moved through the familiar passages, then diverted into older sections of the palace, following a route I'd mapped out over the past 3 days. The Chapel of Sorrows was in a part of the complex that few people visited, accessible through a series of narrow corridors and forgotten courtyards. I found it by the smell, that distinctive scent of old stone and older magic, mixed with the sweet decay of abandonment. The chapel itself was a small structure, probably beautiful once, now wrapped in ivy and shadow. The courtyard behind it was little more than a clearing surrounded by high walls, paved with stones that had cracked and shifted over the decades. Seraphine was already there. She stood in the center of the courtyard and I nearly didn't recognize her. Gone was the elegant gown and aristocratic bearing. Instead, she wore practical traveling leathers in deep blacks and grays, her hair pulled back in a severe braid, her wings folded tight against her back. She looked human. Or as close to human as a 300-year-old vampire queen could look. Dangerous. Ready. You're early, she said, turning as I approached. I like that. You said moonrise. I try to be punctual. You also came alone. Even better. She gestured to 2 horses tied to a post near the wall, massive destriers bred for the northern roads, already saddled and provisioned. We're traveling as far as we can tonight before stopping. The further we get from the palace before anyone notices you're missing, the better. Won't your court notice you're gone? I left instructions that I was entering a 3-day meditation and was not to be disturbed. By the time they realize I'm gone, we'll be too far away to easily recall. She moved to the horses, checking saddles and straps with practiced efficiency. Can you ride? Well enough. You'll need to do better than well enough. We're taking the shadow roads, paths that aren't on any human map. Vampire trails through the wilderness. If you fall behind, I won't wait for you. It should have sounded like a threat. Somehow, coming from her, it sounded like a challenge. Maybe even a joke. I approached the horse she indicated, a massive black gelding with intelligent eyes and a surprising calmness around the vampire scent. What's his name? Midnight. Original, I know, but he was already called that when I acquired him. She swung onto her own mount with inhuman grace, settling into the saddle as if she'd been born there. Yours is Shadow Step. He's sure-footed and won't spook easily. You'll need both qualities where we're going. I mounted with considerably less grace, but Shadow Step accepted me without complaint. The horse did indeed seem remarkably calm, considering his rider was human and his companion was being ridden by a vampire. Seraphine noticed my expression. I've been conditioning them for weeks. Can't have them panicking every time I get close. You've been planning this that long? Longer. She turned her horse toward a gap in the wall I hadn't noticed before, a narrow archway hidden by overgrown vines. I've been planning this since the first blight reports came in 2 years ago. You're just the first human diplomat who seemed capable of understanding what I was trying to do. Before I could respond, she urged Midnight forward, and the horse moved through the archway like a shadow sliding through darkness. I followed, and the moment Shadow Step passed under that vine-covered arch, the world changed. The sounds of the palace, the distant voices, the clatter of activity, vanished as if someone had closed a door. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying scents of pine and snow even though we were still technically within the palace grounds. The moonlight, which had been bright in the courtyard, became dimmer, filtered through trees that hadn't been there a moment ago. Magic. We'd crossed a threshold into whatever pocket of altered reality Seraphine used for her secret travels. "Stay close," she said, her voice carrying easily in the strange silence. "The shadow roads are safe for those who know them, but they don't take kindly to wanderers. If you lose sight of me, stop immediately and call out. Don't try to find your own way, you won't like where you end up." Comforting. I'm not here to comfort you, Marcus. I'm here to save the world. Comfort is a luxury neither of us can afford anymore. And with that, she urged Midnight into a canter, and we plunged into the impossible forest, leaving the palace, and all its rules and safety and certainty behind us. The journey north had begun. Whatever happened next, whatever Seraphine and I built or destroyed in the weeks to come, it started in that moment. A human and a vampire riding into the darkness, choosing to trust each other because the alternative was extinction. No guards. No witnesses. No going back. Just the shadow road ahead and the weight of two civilizations resting on a gamble neither of us was sure we could win. But we were going to try. God and God's help us, we were going to try. The first thing I learned about the shadow roads was that they existed outside normal geography. We rode for what felt like hours, but when I checked my chronometer, only 20 minutes had passed. Or sometimes it was the reverse. A brief gallop through a section of forest that seemed to last mere seconds, then a glance at my watch revealing we'd somehow lost an hour. Time was negotiable here. Space was a suggestion. The rules that govern the normal world simply didn't apply. "Don't think about it too hard," Seraphine called back to me as we navigated a particularly twisted section where the trees seemed to grow in impossible directions, their branches weaving together overhead to form a tunnel of wood and shadow. The shadow roads respond to intention more than logic. If you try to understand them, you'll just give yourself a headache. "Too late," I muttered, but I followed her advice and stopped trying to make sense of our surroundings. Instead, I focused on riding, on keeping Shadow Step steady, on watching Seraphine's silhouette ahead of me as she guided us through this maze of altered reality. She rode like someone who'd been born in the saddle, her body moving with Midnight's rhythm, her wings shifting subtly to maintain balance. Every so often she'd glance back to check on me, and in those moments I'd catch a glimpse of her face in the strange half-light of the shadow road, focused, intense, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her vampiric perfection and everything to do with the fierce intelligence behind her eyes. We didn't talk much during that first stretch of riding. The shadow roads demanded concentration, and there was something about the atmosphere that discouraged casual conversation. It felt like we were moving through a space that was listening, evaluating, deciding whether to allow our passage or cast us out into whatever void existed beyond the edges of this impossible path. But eventually we emerged. The transition was abrupt. One moment we were surrounded by the twisted forest of the shadow road, the next we were cantering through ordinary woods under a normal night sky. The change was so sudden I actually gasped, and Seraphine pulled up her horse, turning to watch my reaction with amusement. "Takes some getting used to," she said. "The first time I traveled the shadow roads I was sick for 3 days afterward. You're doing remarkably well." "I don't feel like I'm doing well. I feel like my brain is trying to escape through my ears." "That's normal. It'll pass." She dismounted in a fluid motion and began checking Midnight's tack. "We'll rest here for a few hours, let the horses recover. The shadow roads are hard on them too, they're designed for vampire travel, not living creatures." I climbed down from Shadow Step with considerably less grace, my legs unsteady after hours of riding through impossible space. We were in a clearing surrounded by pine trees, the air sharp with the scent of resin and cold. Somewhere nearby I could hear running water. "Where are we?" I asked, looking around. The forest seemed ordinary enough, but after the shadow road, I wasn't willing to trust appearances. About 200 miles north of Valdres. In human terms, we've just crossed into the disputed territories, land that both your confederacy and my kingdom claim but neither effectively controls. She pulled a leather pack from Midnight's saddle and began unpacking supplies. There's a stream just past those trees. Fill our water skins and clean up if you need to. We've got about 3 hours before we need to move again. I found the stream right where she'd indicated, a narrow creek running cold and clear over smooth stones. I filled the water skins she'd given me, then splashed water on my face, trying to wash away the disorientation of the shadow road. The cold helped, shocking my system back into something resembling normal awareness. When I returned to the clearing, Seraphine had built a small fire, barely more than a few burning branches, but enough to provide light and a little warmth. She'd spread out a blanket and was sitting cross-legged, examining a map by the firelight. "You don't need to eat, I assume?" I asked, settling down across from her. "I fed before we left. I can go weeks without blood if necessary, though I'm more pleasant company when I'm well fed." She looked up from the map, and there was dark humor in her expression. "That was a joke, by the way. I'm trying to put you at ease." "It's working," I lied, and she laughed, that wind chime sound I'd heard in her chambers. "No, it's not. You're terrified of me, Marcus. You're just very good at hiding it." She folded the map and set it aside. "It's all right. You should be terrified. I'm 300 years old, I can kill you in a dozen different ways, and you're completely dependent on me for survival in territory you don't know. Fear is rational. And yet you want me to trust you. Trust and fear aren't mutually exclusive. I trust you and I'm a little bit afraid of you too." She pulled her knees up to her chest and for a moment she looked young. Not the ancient queen but just a woman sitting by a campfire. "You have the power to destroy what I'm trying to build. If you go back to your council and tell them everything I've said, frame it the right way, you could turn me into a pariah among my own people. You could start a civil war in my kingdom that would make the blight irrelevant because we'd tear ourselves apart before it arrived." I hadn't thought of it that way. Hadn't considered that I held that kind of power over her. Why risk it then? Why trust me at all? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Her wings shifted, catching the light, and I noticed details I'd missed before. The delicate structure of them, the way they seemed to be both organic and architectural, like living stained glass. "Because I'm tired, Marcus." Her voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear. "I've been queen for 150 years. I've fought wars, made treaties, balanced factions, played the Game of Thrones with the best of them. And I'm good at it. I'm very good at it. But the blight doesn't care about my political skills. It doesn't care about power or tradition or the careful balance I've maintained. It's going to kill my people and your people and every living thing in its path, and all my centuries of experience are worthless against it." She looked up at me and in her wine-dark eyes I saw something I hadn't expected: vulnerability. I needed someone who wasn't part of the old system. Someone who could see the problem without all the baggage of history weighing down their judgment. And when I researched you, when I read about the Thornhaven crisis and how you solved it by ignoring every piece of conventional wisdom, I thought, here's someone who might understand. Here's someone who might be brave enough, or crazy enough, to help me do what needs to be done. I pulled out the dried meat and hard bread I'd packed, more to have something to do with my hands than because I was hungry. "You could have approached this differently. Could have gone through official channels, proposed a formal alliance. Which would have been debated for years while the blight spread. No. This needed to be fast, decisive, and personal." She accepted a piece of bread when I offered it, though I doubted she'd eat it. "I need you to understand something, Marcus. What we're doing, this journey, this treaty we're going to write, it's not just politics. It's not just survival strategy. It's a revolution. We're going to overturn 500 years of separation, break down walls that our ancestors built with blood and trauma. And we're going to do it in a matter of weeks before anyone can stop us." "That's insane." "Yes, it is." She smiled then, sharp and fierce. "But it's the only kind of insane that might actually work." I ate my bread and thought about Elena, about her crazy conviction that medicine could bridge any divide. About the way she treated humans and vampires with the same dedication, even when it killed her. My sister, I said slowly, she was a healer in the Borderlands. She died of a blight variant 3 years ago. I pulled out the miniature portrait and showed it to Seraphine. She would have liked you. She always said the division between humans and vampires was artificial, that we were letting history trap us in patterns that didn't serve anyone. Seraphine took the portrait with careful fingers, studying Elena's painted face. She was beautiful. I'm sorry for your loss. She was brave. Braver than I'll ever be. I took the portrait back and tucked it away. I'm doing this for her as much as for any rational reason. Because she believed impossible things were possible, and I owe it to her memory to at least try. Then we're both doing this for ghosts. Seraphine stood, brushing off her leathers. I had a human friend once before I was turned. Her name was Catherine and she was the smartest person I ever knew. When the turning plague came, I survived it and she didn't. I've spent 300 years trying to honor her memory by being a good queen, by protecting my people. But I think what would honor her most is this, refusing to let the old hatreds define us forever. She held out her hand and I took it, letting her pull me to my feet. The contact was becoming familiar now, losing some of its shock value. She was just Seraphine. A person. A queen. A survivor. A partner in this insane gamble. We should get moving, she said. We've got another Shadow Road jump to make before dawn, and this one's longer. I want to reach the Blackstone Fortress in 4 days instead of the usual 10. How many more Shadow Roads? 2 more major jumps, a few smaller transitions. By the time we reach Blackstone, you'll be practically a native of the Shadow Roads. Or you'll have lost your mind completely. Either way, it'll be educational. I couldn't help laughing at that, and she grinned in response, looking pleased with herself. We packed up camp efficiently, working in a rhythm that was starting to feel natural. Her handling the more physical tasks with vampire strength, me managing the detailed work that required careful human attention. As we mounted up again and Seraphine led us toward the next Shadow Road threshold, this one marked by 2 trees that had grown together to form a natural arch, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I was afraid of failing. Afraid of the blight. Afraid of what would happen if we couldn't make this work. But Seraphine herself? She'd stopped being a monster in my mind somewhere between the handshake in her chamber and this moment. Now she was just a person I was working with. A complicated, ancient, dangerous person, but a person nonetheless. Maybe that was the first step to her unification. Not grand treaties or political maneuvering, but simply learning to see each other as real. To sit by the same fire and share the same bread and work toward the same goal. We plunged into the Shadow Road again, and this time I didn't fight the disorientation. I just rode, following Seraphine's lead, trusting her to guide us through the impossible spaces between places. And somewhere in that twisted forest of altered reality, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could actually pull this off. We reached the Blackstone Fortress on the morning of the 4th day, emerging from the final Shadow Road jump into a landscape that took my breath away, and not in a good way. The blight. I'd seen reports, read descriptions, studied the maps with their spreading red zones. But nothing had prepared me for the reality. To the north, beyond the fortress walls, the land was wrong. The trees stood skeletal and gray, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. The ground itself seemed diseased, covered in a crystalline growth that glittered in the morning light like broken glass. Even the sky above the blight zone had a sickly cast to it, as if the contamination had spread upward into the air itself. God, I whispered, staring at the devastation. It's worse than the reports said. It's much worse. Seraphine sat rigid in her saddle, her wings spread slightly in what I'd learned was a sign of tension. And it's spreading faster than even I anticipated. See that ridge? She pointed to a line of hills about 5 miles north of the fortress. When I was here 3 months ago, the blight stopped at the base of those hills. Now it's crested the ridge and is moving toward the river valley. How long until it reaches the fortress? 6 months. Maybe a year if we're lucky and the spread slows during winter. She turned midnight toward the fortress gates. The northern lords don't want to hear that. They want me to tell them we can push it back, reclaim the lost territory. They want a military solution to a problem that can't be solved with swords and strategy. The Blackstone fortress itself was a massive structure carved directly into a mountainside, all black stone and iron gates, built during the old wars to withstand centuries of assault. It had succeeded at that task admirably. The walls showed no signs of age or weakness. But walls meant nothing against the blight. Guards watched from the towers as we approached. Vampires in black armor, their amber eyes tracking our progress. They recognized their queen immediately, but I could see the confusion when they spotted me riding beside her. A human. No escort. No ceremony. Just the queen and a stranger returning from, where? The gates opened as we approached, and we rode into a courtyard filled with activity. Soldiers training, servants rushing about, the organized chaos of a military installation on high alert. And vampires. So many vampires. More than I'd ever seen in one place, all of them turning to stare as Seraphine and I dismounted. "Stay close," she murmured to me. "My northern lords are traditional. They won't take kindly to a human in their fortress, let alone one riding beside their queen with no guards present." Should I be worried? Probably. But don't show it. She straightened her shoulders, and just like that, the woman I'd been traveling with, the one who'd shared bread by the campfire and laughed at my jokes, vanished. In her place stood the vampire queen, imperious and untouchable. "Remember, you're here as my partner, not my prisoner. Act accordingly." A vampire in ornate armor approached, dropping to one knee before Seraphine. "My queen. We received no word of your arrival. If we had known. I came by the shadow roads, Commander Voss. No need for ceremony." She pulled off her riding gloves with sharp, efficient movements. "Gather the northern lords in the war chamber. I'll address them in 1 hour." "Yes, my queen." "And a human?" He said the word like it tasted bad. "Ambassador Marcus Thorne of the Human Confederacy. He's my guest and under my personal protection. Anyone who harms him answers to me directly. Make sure that's understood by everyone in the fortress." Voss's eyes widened slightly, the only sign of his shock, but he nodded and hurried off to relay orders. Other servants came forward to take our horses, and Seraphine led me into the fortress proper. The interior was as imposing as the exterior, all stone corridors and iron fixtures, lit by torches that burned with an eerie blue flame. We climbed stairs carved directly into the mountain, passed through halls where vampire warriors trained with weapons I didn't recognize, moved deeper into the heart of the fortress until we reached a heavy door guarded by 2 of the largest vampires I'd ever seen. "The war chamber," Seraphine said. "This is where the northern lords gather to make decisions about the blight and the defense of the territories. In an hour, you and I are going to walk in there and tell them everything is about to change." She looked at me and some of her earlier warmth returned. "Are you ready?" "No. But I don't think that's going to stop us." "Good answer." She pushed open the door, revealing a circular chamber dominated by a massive table carved from a single piece of black stone. Maps covered its surface, marked with the spreading blight zones and defensive positions. "This is where we make history, Marcus. Let's not waste the opportunity." The hour passed too quickly. Seraphine disappeared to change into more formal attire, leaving me alone in an antechamber with guards who watched my every movement with undisguised hostility. I used the time to review the documents I'd brought, to prepare the arguments I knew we'd need, to steel myself for what was coming. When Seraphine returned, she transformed again. She wore the regalia of her office now, a gown of deep crimson and black, her wings fully displayed, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that incorporated her crown, a delicate circlet of silver and onyx that seemed to float above her head, held in place by magic. She looked every inch the ancient queen, beautiful and terrible and absolutely in command. "Show time," she said and led me into the war chamber. The northern lords were already assembled, 5 of them each representing a different territory on the front lines of the blight. I recognized them from my briefings: Lord Draven of the Ironwood, Lady Morgana of the Shattered Peaks, Lord Blackthorn of the Red Wastes, Lord Ashenheart of the Frozen March and Lady Crimson of the Shadow Vale. Ancient vampires, All of them, powerful enough to maintain their own territories, loyal enough to answer their queen's summons. They stood as Seraphine entered, bowing with the precise formality of old nobility. Then they saw me and the temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. "Your Majesty," Lord Draven said, his voice like gravel grinding against stone. "We were told to expect you but not this." He stared at me with open contempt. "A human? In the war chamber? Surely you don't intend." "I intend exactly what I'm doing, Draven." Seraphine moved to the head of the table, and I took the position beside her, the same position I'd occupied in her chambers back in Valdris. The symbolism wasn't lost on the assembled lords. "Ambassador Thorn is here because I invited him. Because the discussions we're about to have concern his people as much as ours. Because the Blight doesn't care about our ancient divisions, and neither can we if we want to survive." Lady Morgana, a striking vampire with hair like silver moonlight, leaned forward. "You're proposing an alliance? Your Majesty, we've tried that before. Humans can't be trusted to honor their—" "I'm not proposing an alliance." Seraphine's voice cut through the objections like a knife. "I'm proposing a unification. Not two kingdoms working together, but one civilization rising to meet a threat that will destroy us both if we remain divided." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Lord Blackthorn started laughing, a harsh, bitter sound. "A unification? With humans? Has the weight of your crown finally crushed your sanity, my queen? Watch your tone, Blackthorn." The temperature dropped further, and I felt the pressure of Seraphine's power filling the room. This was the queen who'd ruled for a century and a half, who'd held her kingdom together through countless challenges. This was the power that made vampires kneel. "I speak of survival, not fantasy. Ambassador Thorn, share with my lords what your intelligence has revealed about the Blight's progression." This was my moment. I'd prepared for this, rehearsed the arguments during our journey. But standing in a room full of ancient vampires, feeling their hostile gazes, I had to force my voice to remain steady. "The Human Confederacy's mage towers have been tracking the Blight for 2 years. I began pulling out the charts and projections I'd brought. Our analysis shows that the contamination isn't just spreading, it's accelerating. 6 months ago, it was moving at roughly 1 mile per month. Now it's moving at 3 miles per month, and the rate continues to increase." I spread the maps across the table, showing the projections. If this progression continues, the Blight will reach the borderlands in 18 months. It will hit the major human cities in 3 years. In 5 years, everything north of the Sun Wall will be uninhabitable. In 10 years, I traced my finger across the map, showing the inevitable conclusion. In 10 years there won't be anywhere left to run. "Your human mages could be wrong," Lady Crimson said, but her voice lacked conviction. "They could be," I agreed. "But can you afford to bet your people's survival on that possibility? Can any of us?" Lord Ashenheart, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. His voice was cultured, thoughtful, dangerous. "Let's assume your projections are correct, Ambassador. Why does that require a unification? Why not simply an agreement to share resources, combined research, perhaps a joint military campaign? Because half measures won't be enough." Seraphine's voice was firm. "The Blight isn't just a contamination we can fight with conventional methods. It's a fundamental corruption of reality itself. Our scholars believe it's related to the old magics that created the Turning Plague, the same forces that made us what we are. Fighting it will require combining everything we know: human magic and vampire bloodcraft, human innovation and vampire longevity, human adaptability and vampire strength." She looked around the table, meeting each lord's gaze. "More than that, it will require trust. Real trust, not the careful dance of political alliance. We need to become one people, working toward one goal, because divided we will absolutely fall." "And you propose this human as what, exactly?" Draven gestured at me dismissively. "Your advisor? Your pet? Your proof of concept?" I felt anger flash through me, but before I could respond, Seraphine's hand landed on my shoulder, a gesture that was both reassuring and cautionary. "I propose him as my partner in crafting the treaty that will make unification possible. I propose him as evidence that a human and a vampire can sit beside each other without guards, without fear, without the weight of history crushing every interaction. I propose him as the first step toward something new. She paused, and her next words were quieter but carried more weight. And I propose that if you cannot accept one human diplomat in this room, you have no right to call yourselves defenders of our people. Because our people are already doomed if we can't bridge this divide. The silence returned, heavier than before. Finally, Lady Morgana spoke. You've clearly thought this through, Your Majesty. And I admit the ambassador's projections are troubling. But even if we agreed to this unification in principle, how would it work? 500 years of war don't just vanish because we decide they should. No, I said, seizing the opening she provided. They don't. Which is why the Unification Treaty needs to address not just political structure but social transformation. We're proposing a 10-year integration period with clearly defined phases. Year 1 focuses on research cooperation and intelligence sharing. Low risk, high reward. Year 2 begins limited population mixing in border zones, creating communities where humans and vampires live together under unified law. Years 3 through 5 expand those zones while we develop the educational programs and social structures needed for lasting peace. I'd spent every night of our journey thinking through these details, arguing with Seraphine about implementation, refining the proposal until it was something that might actually work. Now I laid it all out for the Northern Lords, watching their expressions shift from hostility to reluctant interest. Years 6 through 10, I continued, complete the integration with full political unification, combined military forces and shared governance structures. At the end of 10 years, we're no longer the human confederacy and the vampire kingdom. We're one civilization with one government and one goal. An inspiring vision, Lord Blackthorne said dryly. And completely impossible. You're asking vampires to live alongside food. You're asking humans to trust creatures who've been hunting them for 5 centuries. You're asking both sides to betray everything they believe about each other. Yes, Seraphine said simply. I am. Because the alternative is extinction, and I'd rather die trying to save both our peoples than watch them die separately while we cling to old hatreds. She straightened, and her wings spread to their full span, filling the chamber with shadow and presence. This was the vampire queen in all her terrible glory, and every lord in the room felt the weight of her power. I'm not asking for your approval, she said, her voice ringing with authority. I'm informing you of what will happen. Ambassador Thorne and I are drafting the Unification Treaty. When we return to Valdris, we will present it to both our governments as an accomplished fact. Your choice isn't whether this happens. Your choice is whether you support your queen in the greatest undertaking our people have ever attempted, or whether you'll be remembered as the lords who chose pride over survival. It was a gamble. A massive, dangerous gamble. She was using her authority as queen to force their hand, banking on the fact that these lords, however traditional, however hostile to humans, were ultimately loyal to her and to their people. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then Lord Ashenheart did something unexpected. He laughed, not with mockery but with what sounded like genuine admiration. Well played, Your Majesty. You've maneuvered us beautifully. He stood and bowed, deeper than protocol required. You have my support. Not because I believe this unification will work, I think the odds are against us. But because you're right about one thing, doing nothing guarantees our destruction. At least this way we die trying. One by one the other lords stood as well. Some with more grace than others, some with visible reluctance, but all of them eventually bowing their acknowledgement. All except Lord Draven. He remained seated, his expression dark. You're making a mistake, Seraphine. Humans cannot be trusted. Their magic created the blight in the first place, their wars devastated the land, their ambassador is standing right here, Draven, and he can hear you. Seraphine's voice was cold. If you have accusations to make about the past, we can debate historical responsibility another time. Right now I need to know, are you with me or against me? Draven stood slowly, and I saw his hand rest on the sword at his hip. For a terrible moment I thought he might actually challenge her, challenge us. But then he released the blade and bowed stiffly. I serve the throne, he said. Even when I believe the throne is wrong. That's all I ask. Seraphine relaxed slightly and the pressure in the room eased. We have a great deal of work to do, my lords. Ambassador Thorne and I will spend the next 3 days here, finalizing the treaty and gathering intelligence from your scouts about the Blight's progression. I'll need detailed reports from each of your territories, and I'll need your oath that what's discussed in this room remains confidential until we're ready to make the announcement. They gave their oaths, one by one, and slowly the meeting dissolved into more practical discussions. Logistics, intelligence sharing, the specifics of what we'd need from each territory. I found myself drawn into conversations about defensive positions and resource distribution, surprised to discover that once the initial hostility had been overcome, several of the lords were actually willing to engage with me as an equal. Hours later, when the meeting finally ended and Seraphine and I retreated to private quarters, I practically collapsed onto a chair. That, I said, was the most terrifying experience of my life. You did well. She poured 2 glasses of wine, blood wine for her, regular for me, and handed me one. You stood your ground, presented our arguments clearly, and didn't let Draven intimidate you. I'm impressed. Draven's going to be a problem. Draven has always been a problem. But he's loyal to the throne, and that's what matters. She sank into the chair across from me, and for the first time since we'd entered the fortress, she looked tired. Really tired, the kind of exhaustion that even vampire resilience couldn't completely hide. We have 3 days to finish the treaty, Marcus. 3 days to put on paper what we've been building during our journey. Then we ride back to Valdris and change the world. No pressure. She smiled. None at all. We sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping our wine, each lost in thought. Outside, I could hear the sounds of the fortress settling into evening routines. Guards changing shifts, supplies being moved, the eternal business of military life. Thank you, Seraphine said quietly. I looked up. For what? For being here. For not running when you had the chance. For believing that this insane plan might actually work. She stared into her wine glass, and in the candlelight she looked young again. Vulnerable. I've been carrying this alone for so long, Marcus. Every decision, every calculation, every sleepless night wondering if I was leading my people toward salvation or disaster. Having someone beside me, it makes it bearable. I thought about my sister, about her belief in impossible things. About the choice I'd made to shake Seraphine's hand in that golden chamber. We're in this together now, I said. Partners, remember? Whatever happens next, we face it together. She met my eyes and something passed between us. Not attraction, not romance, but something deeper. Recognition. The bond that forms between people who've chosen to stand against the darkness together, who've risked everything for a chance at something better. Together, she agreed and raised her glass. I raised mine in return and we drank to the impossible. To the unification. To hope. The next 3 days at Blackstone Fortress were among the most intense of my life. Seraphine and I barely slept, working from dawn until well past midnight, hammering out the details of what we were calling the Treaty of Wings and Walls, a name that came to me on the second night when we were both half delirious with exhaustion. Wings for the vampires, walls for the humans, both coming down to build something new. The Northern Lords contributed more than I'd expected. Lord Ashenheart turned out to have a brilliant mind for legal frameworks, and he helped us structure the governance provisions in ways that protected both human and vampire rights. Lady Morgana provided detailed intelligence about the Blight's properties, information that helped us design the combined research initiative. Even Lord Draven, despite his obvious hostility, contributed strategic insights about defensive integration that were invaluable. But the real work was between Seraphine and me, in those late-night hours when everyone else had gone to rest and we were left alone with candles and documents and the weight of history we were trying to rewrite. The hardest part is going to be the social integration, I said on the second night, rubbing my eyes and trying to focus on the section we were drafting about mixed communities. You can mandate political cooperation, but you can't mandate people changing their minds about each other. No, but you can create the conditions where minds change naturally. Seraphine was sprawled in her chair in a decidedly unqueenly way, her crown discarded on the table, her wings drooping with fatigue. That's why the border zones are crucial. Put humans and vampires together in circumstances where they have to cooperate to survive, and eventually the old prejudices start to break down. It's happened before in smaller scales. We just need to replicate it on a massive level. Your people will resist. Mine too. Of course they will. Change is terrifying, especially change this fundamental. She picked up one of our earlier drafts and scanned it with a critical eye. We need enforcement mechanisms. Real ones with teeth. Both our governments will try to sabotage this if they think they can get away with it. I've been thinking about that problem. What if we create a joint oversight council? Representatives from both sides, equal numbers, with the power to investigate and punish violations of the treaty. But here's the key. Membership on the council requires living in a mixed community for at least 1 year. That way the people enforcing integration have personally experienced it. Seraphine looked up and I saw approval in her eyes. That's clever. Self-reinforcing. The more the council works, the more proof we have that integration is possible. I like it. We wrote it into the treaty, one more provision among hundreds, each one a small brick in the bridge we were building between our peoples. On the third day, Lord Blackthorn requested a private meeting with me. Seraphine insisted on being present, protective in a way that I found both touching and slightly amusing, but Blackthorn assured her he meant no harm. I wanted to apologize, Ambassador Thorn, he said, surprising me completely. I was dismissive during our first meeting. I let my prejudices speak louder than my reason. Having worked with you these past days, I see that I was wrong. About the unification? About you. About the possibility that a human could understand our situation, could contribute meaningfully to solving it. He gestured to the stack of documents we'd produced. This treaty is remarkable work. If it succeeds, and that's still a significant if, it will be because you and our queen were willing to see past what we all assumed was impossible. Thank you, Lord Blackthorn. That means more than you know. I still don't entirely trust humans, he added with a wry smile. But I'm beginning to trust you. Perhaps that's progress. It was progress. Small, tentative, fragile progress, but progress nonetheless. On the final evening before our departure, Seraphine called another meeting of the Northern Lords. This time the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of hostility, there was cautious optimism. Instead of resistance, there was engagement. The treaty is complete, Seraphine announced, setting the bound document on the table. 200 pages of carefully crafted provisions, phased timelines, enforcement mechanisms, and constitutional frameworks. Ambassador Thorn and I will carry this back to Valdris, where we'll present it to both our governments simultaneously. I won't lie to you, the reception will likely be hostile. We'll face opposition from traditionalists on both sides, accusations of treason, possibly even assassination attempts. Then why do it? Lady Crimson asked. Why not take more time, build more support, approach this more gradually? Because we don't have more time, I said, standing beside Seraphine in what had become our customary position. Every day we delay, the blight spreads further. Every month we spend building consensus is a month we lose in the fight for survival. Sometimes the only way forward is to take a leap and trust that you'll find solid ground on the other side. Or you'll fall, Lord Draven muttered, but there was less venom in his voice than before. Or we'll fall, Seraphine agreed. But I'd rather fall trying to save both our peoples than stand safely while they perish separately. My lords, I need you to hold the north while we're gone. I need you to continue gathering intelligence about the blight, to maintain defensive positions, and most importantly to prepare your people for what's coming. When the unification is announced, there will be chaos. Your territories need to be ready to be examples of how this can work. They pledged their support each in their own way. Even Draven, grudgingly, swore an oath to uphold the treaty once it was ratified. That night, Seraphine and I stood on the fortress walls, looking out at the blight-corrupted lands to the north. The contamination was eerily beautiful in the moonlight, the crystalline growths glittering like a field of broken stars. It's spreading faster, she said quietly. Even in the 3 days we've been here, I can see the difference. We're running out of time, Marcus. I know. I pulled my coat tighter against the cold wind. Do you think they'll accept it? The treaty? Honestly? I think there's a 50-50 chance both our governments will reject it outright and have us executed for treason. She glanced at me, and there was dark humor in her expression. Not exactly reassuring odds. No. But better than the alternative. I looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the way she carried the weight of her 300 years with grace. Whatever happens when we get back to Valdres, I want you to know, this has been worth it. Working with you, building this treaty, seeing that maybe the old divisions don't have to define us forever. Even if it all falls apart, it was worth it. Something shifted in her expression. She reached out and took my hand, not a handshake this time, just holding hands, two people standing against the darkness together. You surprised me, Marcus Thorne. When I first brought you to my chambers, I thought you were just a means to an end. A clever human who could help me accomplish a goal. But you've become more than that. You've become a friend. One of the few I've had in a very long time. Friends? I repeated, feeling the weight and warmth of that word. I like that. Friends who are trying to save the world. The best kind of friends. We stood there for a while longer, watching the blight glitter in the distance, feeling the cold wind bite at our faces, holding on to each other in the darkness. And in that moment, I understood what we'd really accomplished in these 3 days. We'd proven that it was possible. Not the grand political unification, not the restructuring of civilization. Those were still uncertain. But the simple, fundamental possibility of a human and a vampire standing together, working together, trusting each other. We'd proven that 500 years of division could be overcome by two people willing to see each other as real. If we could do it, maybe our peoples could too. Maybe. We left Blackstone Fortress at dawn, the treaty secured in waterproof leather cases that we divided between us. Insurance against losing everything if one of us was captured or killed. The Northern Lords came to see us off, a show of solidarity that I appreciated more than I could express. Safe travels, Your Majesty, Lord Ashenheart said, bowing. Then, surprisingly, he turned to me and offered a hand, a human gesture from a vampire lord. And you, Ambassador. You've given us something we haven't had in a long time, hope. Don't waste it. I'll do my best, I promised, shaking his hand. The journey back was both faster and more tense than the journey north. We pushed harder, taking fewer breaks, using the shadow roads more aggressively. Seraphine was quiet for much of the ride, clearly preparing herself mentally for what we'd face in Valdres. On the second night, camped in another forest clearing, she finally spoke about what was worrying her. When we arrive back at the palace, everything changes, she said, staring into our small fire. Right now we're just two people who've made an agreement. The moment we present this treaty, we become revolutionaries. Traitors to some, saviors to others, but certainly not the same people we were when we left. I know. I've been thinking about it too. I poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise into the night sky. My career in the diplomatic corps is over, assuming they don't execute me for treason. Your position as queen might be challenged by traditionalist factions. We're both gambling everything on this. And you're still willing to go through with it? Are you? She smiled at that, a genuine warm smile that made her look almost human. Yes. God help me, yes. I've spent 150 years being a careful queen, making calculated decisions, never risking more than I could afford to lose. But this is worth the risk. You've helped me see that. You would have done it without me. Maybe. But it wouldn't have been as good. Your perspective, your ideas, the way you think about problems, all of that made the treaty stronger. Made me stronger. She looked at me across the fire. Whatever happens when we get back, I want you to know that you've changed things, Marcus. Changed me. And I'm grateful for that. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and hoped she understood. We reached the outskirts of Valdres on the evening of the 6th day. Instead of approaching openly, Seraphine led us to a safe house on the city's edge, a nondescript building that turned out to be one of her private bolt holes, unknown to most of her court. We need to coordinate our approach, she said once we were safely inside. If we present the treaty separately, Our respective governments will have time to develop counter-strategies, to isolate us from each other. We need to announce it jointly, publicly, in a way that makes it impossible for either side to suppress. A public forum, I said, thinking it through. Somewhere both humans and vampires gather. Somewhere we can speak directly to the people, not just the ruling councils. The Grand Plaza. It's neutral ground right on the border between human and vampire quarters. If we call for a public assembly there, she trailed off, considering. It's risky. Very risky. We'll be exposed, vulnerable to attack from extremists on both sides. Everything we've done has been risky. Why stop now? She laughed at that and we began planning. It took 2 more days to arrange. Seraphine sent messages through trusted intermediaries, calling for an emergency assembly to address matters of survival for all peoples of Valdres. I did the same through my own limited contacts in the human community. Neither of us revealed what we'd announce, just that it was urgent and concerned the Blight. On the evening of the assembly, I dressed in my formal diplomatic attire, the first time I'd worn it since leaving for Blackstone. It felt strange, like putting on a costume from a previous life. I was still Ambassador Marcus Thorne, but I wasn't the same man who'd walked into Seraphine's chambers 3 weeks ago. Seraphine appeared in full royal regalia again, magnificent and terrible in her crimson gown and floating crown, her wings spread to their full span. But when she looked at me, I saw the woman I'd traveled with, camped with, argued and laughed with over treaty provisions at midnight. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," I confirmed, tucking the treaty case under my arm. We made our way to the Grand Plaza separately. It wouldn't do to arrive together before the announcement, but we timed it so we'd reach the platform at the same moment. The plaza was packed when I arrived, thousands of humans and vampires filling every available space, all of them buzzing with speculation about what the Vampire Queen and a Confederacy ambassador needed to announce jointly. I climbed the steps to the speaking platform, my heart hammering. Across the crowd I could see Councillor Graves and other Confederacy officials, their faces tight with confusion and anger. They knew something was wrong, knew I'd gone off script, but they didn't know how badly yet. Seraphine arrived from the opposite side of the plaza, moving through her people with the natural authority of a queen. She climbed the platform steps and we met at the center, the two of us standing before thousands of watching eyes. This was it. The moment we'd been building toward. Seraphine spoke first, her voice magically amplified to reach the entire plaza. "My people. Citizens of Valdres, both vampire and human. I stand before you tonight not just as your queen, but as someone who has seen the future, and it is dark." She gestured, and illusions sprang up around the plaza. Images of the Blight, of the corrupted lands spreading south, of the projections showing its inevitable advance. The crowd gasped, murmured, reacted with shock and fear. "This is what we face," she continued. "Not in some distant future but now. Within our lifetimes, within our children's lifetimes, the Blight will consume everything we've built. Unless we change." Then she gestured to me and I stepped forward. "The Human Confederacy has known about this threat for 2 years," I said, my own voice amplified. "Our mages have been studying it, tracking it, trying to find solutions. We've failed. Because the Blight is too big, too powerful for any one civilization to fight alone." I held up the treaty case. 3 weeks ago, Queen Seraphine and I began a journey together. We traveled to the front lines, met with the Northern Lords, saw firsthand the devastation the Blight is causing. And together, we drafted a document that represents our people's only chance at survival. Seraphine took the treaty from me and held it high. The Treaty of Wings and Walls. A unification of human and vampire into one civilization, one government, one people working toward one goal: survival. It outlines a 10-year integration process, with protections for both sides, enforcement mechanisms and a clear path forward. The plaza erupted in chaos, shouts, arguments, people screaming their approval or their outrage. I saw Councillor Graves pushing toward the platform, his face purple with rage. I saw vampire nobles doing the same from the other side, looking equally furious. But I also saw something else. I saw ordinary people, human and vampire both, listening, considering. beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, this insane proposal was the truth. "I know this frightens you," Seraphine called out over the noise. "I know it challenges everything you've been taught to believe. But look around you. Look at this plaza, at humans and vampires standing together to hear this announcement. If we can share this space, can't we share a future?" Ambassador Thorne. Graves had reached the platform steps, guards with him. "You are hereby removed from your post and ordered to return to Confederacy custody for charges of trying to save your lives?" I cut him off, and my voice carried across the plaza. "Counselor, I know you're angry. I know I broke protocol, violated orders, did everything a diplomat isn't supposed to do. But I also know that the reports on your desk show the same projections I've shown tonight. You know we're running out of time. You know we need a solution that's bigger than politics as usual." I turned back to the crowd. "I'm just a minor ambassador. I'm expendable, my superiors have made that clear. But I'm also someone who looked at the problem we face and realized that all our old solutions, all our careful diplomacy and gradual progress, aren't going to work. We need something radical. We need this unification. And we need it now." Seraphine placed her hand on my shoulder, that now familiar gesture of partnership and support. "Ambassador Thorne and I are submitting this treaty to both our governments tonight. But more than that, we're submitting it to you, the people who will live or die based on whether we can make this work. Read it, debate it, challenge it if you find flaws. But do it quickly because the Blight doesn't care about our deliberations." A voice rang out from the crowd, a human woman, middle-aged, wearing the practical clothes of a working-class district. "Will this unification protect us? Will our families be safe from—" she hesitated, glancing at the vampires around her. "From being hunted?" "Yes," Seraphine said firmly. "The treaty includes strict laws against unauthorized feeding, with severe penalties for violations. Vampires will need to use volunteer blood donors or synthetic alternatives that we'll develop jointly. No human will be harmed simply for being human." "And what about us?" a vampire man called out. "Will we be forced to tolerate humans in our sacred spaces, in our ancient halls?" "You'll be asked to share spaces, yes," I responded. "But in return you'll gain access to human technology, human magic, human resources that can help fight the Blight. The treaty includes protections for cultural sites on both sides, but it also requires both our peoples to start seeing each other as allies rather than enemies." More questions came, some hostile, some genuinely curious. We answered them as best we could, Seraphine and I working together seamlessly, backing each other up, presenting a united front. And gradually, slowly, I felt the mood of the crowd shifting. Not everyone was convinced. There were still plenty of people shouting their opposition, still angry faces on both sides. But there were also people nodding, discussing with their neighbors, beginning to engage with the idea rather than reflexively rejecting it. We'd done it. We'd gotten the message out, made it public enough that it couldn't be suppressed or quietly eliminated. Whatever happened next, the idea of unification was now loose in the world. Finally, as the evening grew late and the crowd began to disperse, Seraphine and I descended from the platform. Immediately we were surrounded, guards from both sides, officials demanding explanations, reporters shouting questions. But before we could be separated, before the chaos could pull us apart, Seraphine took my hand and held on tight. "Together," she said, echoing the promise we'd made at Blackstone Fortress. "Together," I agreed. They arrested us both that night, gently, politely, but arrested nonetheless. The Confederacy confined me to my quarters under house arrest. The vampire court did something similar to Seraphine, confining her to her private chambers while the council debated what to do about their queen's revolutionary proposal. But the treaty was out there now. Copies had been distributed throughout the city, and within days it was being read and debated across both human and vampire territories. Some called it brilliance, others called it treason. But everyone was talking about it, thinking about it, forced to confront the reality of the Blight and the question of what we were willing to do to survive. From my windows, I could see the city of Valdres continuing its daily rhythm. But I could also see changes, small ones, tentative ones. I saw humans and vampires gathering in mixed groups to discuss the treaty. I saw barriers coming down, conversations beginning, the first fragile shoots of something new trying to grow. Whether it would be enough, that remained to be seen. But we'd given them the chance. Given them the choice. Given them hope. And sometimes hope is enough to change everything. The house arrest lasted 5 days. 5 agonizing days during which I had no contact with Seraphine, no way of knowing whether our gamble had worked or whether we just guaranteed our execution. I spent the time writing detailed defenses of the treaty, preparing arguments for the inevitable trial I knew was coming, and watching from my window as Valdres City slowly began to transform. The changes were subtle but real. I saw mixed groups gathering in the plaza, saw humans and vampires talking where before they would have separated. I saw copies of the treaty being passed hand to hand, debated in cafes and taverns, discussed by ordinary people who'd never had a say in the political decisions that governed their lives. The revolution wasn't happening in government chambers. It was happening in the streets, in the hearts and minds of people who were beginning to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the old divisions didn't have to be permanent. On the 6th day, Councillor Graves came to my quarters, his expression grim. "You're being brought before a joint tribunal," he said without preamble. "Representatives from both the Confederacy Council and the Vampire Court. They'll determine whether you and Queen Seraphine have committed treason or whether your actions fall under diplomatic immunity." "And Seraphine? She'll be tried alongside you." "Her counsel wanted separate proceedings, but she refused. Said that if you were being judged, she insisted on being judged with you." He shook his head. "You've turned everything into chaos, Thorne. I hope you're proud of yourself." "I'm proud that we've given people a choice," I said. "That's more than our governments were willing to do. Choices are easy when you don't have to live with the consequences. Let's see if you still feel that way after the tribunal renders its verdict." The tribunal was held in the Hall of Accords, a neutral space that had been built centuries ago specifically for resolving disputes between human and vampire authorities. I was brought in under guard, dressed in my diplomatic attire but with my hands bound in front of me, a calculated humiliation meant to demonstrate that I was a prisoner, not a protected ambassador. Seraphine was already there, similarly bound, though she wore her crown and carried herself with such dignity that the chains looked absurd rather than degrading. When she saw me, she smiled, a small, encouraging expression that gave me strength. The tribunal consisted of 10 judges, 5 from each side. I recognized most of them. Councillor Graves representing the Confederacy's conservative faction, Ambassador General Chen representing the military interests, High Mage Alara from the Mage Towers. On the vampire side, I saw Lord Draven, which wasn't encouraging, Lady Morgana, more promising, and several vampire elders whose names I didn't know but whose centuries-old faces suggested they'd seen everything and were impressed by nothing. The presiding judge was a surprise. Lord Ashenheart, the northern lord who'd been so supportive at Blackstone Fortress. He'd apparently been called in as a neutral party since he'd witnessed the treaty's creation. This tribunal is convened to determine whether Queen Seraphine of the Vampire Kingdom and Ambassador Marcus Thorne of the Human Confederacy have committed acts of treason against their respective governments, Ashenheart began, his voice carrying formal authority. Or whether their actions, while unconventional, fall within the scope of their authority and serve the greater good of both peoples. Graves stood immediately. The Confederacy's position is clear. Ambassador Thorne exceeded his authority, negotiated a treaty without approval, and presented it publicly before it could be properly reviewed. These are clear violations of diplomatic protocol and constitute treason against the Confederacy. And the Vampire Court's position? Ashenheart asked. Lord Draven rose. Similar, Your Honor. Queen Seraphine, while sovereign and technically within her rights to negotiate treaties, deliberately concealed her actions from her own council, dismissed her guards in violation of security protocols, and presented a radical proposal without building consensus among her nobles. At minimum, this represents reckless endangerment of her person. At worst, it constitutes a unilateral restructuring of our government without proper process. Interesting, Ashenheart said dryly. So both sides agree that the accused acted improperly, but for different reasons. Let's hear from the accused themselves. Queen Seraphine, you may speak first. Seraphine stood, and despite the chains, despite the hostile tribunal, she commanded the room with her presence. I am charged with exceeding my authority, she said. But I would ask the tribunal, what is the authority of a queen if not to protect her people? What is sovereignty if not the right, the responsibility, to make decisions that ensure survival? She gestured with her bound hands at the judges. You all know what we face. The blight isn't a political problem that can be solved with careful deliberation. It's an existential threat that requires immediate, decisive action. Yes, I dismissed my guards to meet privately with Ambassador Thorne. Yes, I concealed my journey to Blackstone Fortress. Yes, I presented our treaty publicly before seeking council approval. I did all of these things because I believed, I still believe, that traditional processes would have resulted in endless debate while our peoples died. You believed, Draven said coldly. And because you believed, you felt justified in ignoring centuries of protocol, in making decisions that affect millions of lives without consultation? I consulted with someone whose opinion mattered more than political protocol. Someone from the other side of our ancient divide. Someone who could see problems I couldn't see, who brought perspective that my own council lacks. She looked at me. Ambassador Thorne and I spent 3 weeks working together, not as enemies forced into cooperation, but as partners pursuing a common goal. We proved that the fundamental premise of the unification is possible, that humans and vampires can work together, trust each other, build something new together. High Mage Alara spoke up. Beautiful words, Your Majesty. But the treaty you've proposed would fundamentally reshape both our civilizations. It eliminates borders, merges governments, forces our peoples to intermingle in ways that could lead to violence and chaos. How do you justify that risk? By comparing it to the certainty of extinction if we do nothing. Seraphine's voice was firm. The Mage Towers have the same projections we do. You know how fast the blight is spreading. You know that separate defenses won't hold. So I ask you, High Mage, what risk is too great when the alternative is total annihilation? Silence. No one had a good answer to that. Ambassador Thorne, Ashenheart said. Your defense. I stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the chamber. I wasn't a queen. I didn't have centuries of authority to draw on. I was just a minor diplomat who'd made a choice. I can't claim I was protecting my people, I began. I don't have the authority to make that claim. What I can say is this: I was sent to Valdris as an expendable representative, someone whose death wouldn't matter much if negotiations went badly. My superiors made it clear that my purpose was to be a token presence, not to actually accomplish anything meaningful. I looked directly at Graves. But I saw an opportunity. Not for career advancement, not for personal glory, but to actually do what diplomats are supposed to do. Build bridges, find common ground, create solutions to problems that seem impossible. When Queen Seraphine approached me with her proposal, I could have refused. Could have reported to the council and let them handle it. And you all know what would have happened. The proposal would have been buried in committee, studied to death, eventually rejected as too risky. I pulled out the miniature portrait of Elena that I'd carried through the entire journey. My sister was a healer. She died treating blight victims, trying to save people regardless of whether they were human or vampire. Before she died, she told me that the greatest crime wasn't failing to solve a problem. It was refusing to try because the solution seemed too difficult. I held up the portrait for the tribunal to see. I broke protocol for her. For everyone like her who died trying to bridge our divide. For every person in both our civilizations who'll die if we don't find a way to work together. If that's treason, then I'm guilty. But I'd rather be guilty of trying than innocent of doing nothing. The silence that followed was profound. Lady Morgana stood. I would like to propose something unusual. Rather than rendering a verdict today, I suggest we open this tribunal to public testimony. Let the people of Valdris speak about the treaty, about their hopes and fears, about whether they believe unification is worth pursuing. The accused have made their case, let the people make theirs. It was a radical suggestion, and I saw several judges looking uncomfortable with it. But Ashenheart considered it seriously. This would be unprecedented, he said slowly. But then, everything about this situation is unprecedented. Do we have consensus for public testimony? One by one the judges voted. It was close, 6-4 in favor. But it passed. Over the next 3 days, the tribunal heard from dozens of citizens, humans and vampires both, each bringing their perspective on the Unification Treaty. A human farmer talked about how vampire neighbors had helped save his crops during a drought, how cooperation was already happening on small scales. A vampire merchant described trading partnerships with humans that had enriched both sides. A mixed couple, rare, controversial, but real, spoke about the life they'd built together despite the legal and social obstacles. But there were opposing voices too. A human priest spoke passionately about the theological problems with treating vampires as equals. A vampire elder warned that integration would dilute their culture, their identity. A military officer from both sides worried about merged forces, about whether soldiers could trust each other in combat. I sat through it all, listening, taking notes, occasionally catching Seraphine's eye across the chamber. She was absorbing every word, every argument, already thinking about how to address concerns and strengthen the treaty. On the fourth day, Ashenheart called for final arguments. "This tribunal has heard extensive testimony," he said. "We've heard fears and hopes, practical concerns and idealistic visions. Now we must decide, are Queen Seraphine and Ambassador Thorn criminals who exceeded their authority, or are they visionaries who saw what needed to be done and had the courage to do it?" He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that silenced every whisper in the chamber. "I propose a third option. I propose that we find them neither guilty nor innocent, but instead responsible. Responsible for creating a possibility that didn't exist before. Responsible for forcing us all to confront the reality of the blight and our inadequate response to it. Responsible for demonstrating that cooperation between humans and vampires is possible, if we're willing to try." He stood, and the other judges rose with him. "The verdict of this tribunal is as follows. Queen Seraphine and Ambassador Thorn are hereby released from all charges of treason. However, they are also hereby charged with a new responsibility, to refine their treaty based on the concerns raised in this testimony, to build support among both populations, and to prove that this unification they propose can actually work." Graves looked like he wanted to object, but Ambassador General Chen put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Furthermore," Ashenheart continued, "both governments are ordered to provide full cooperation with this effort. The treaty will be treated as an active proposal with the full backing of this tribunal. It will be put to a referendum in 6 months. Both humans and vampires will vote on whether to accept unification. Until then, Ambassador Thorn and Queen Seraphine are authorized to establish pilot programs and volunteer communities, to demonstrate how integration might function." He brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. "This tribunal is adjourned." The chamber erupted in reaction, some cheering, some shouting their opposition. But Seraphine was looking at me with a smile that could have lit up the night sky. "We'd won. Not perfectly, not completely, but we'd won. They removed our chains, and for the first time in over a week, I was free to move without guards surrounding me. I made my way across the chamber to Seraphine, and without thinking, without worrying about protocol or appearances, I pulled her into an embrace. She hugged back, her wings folding around us both, creating a moment of privacy in the chaos. "We did it," she whispered. "God help us, we actually did it. We've done the easy part," I said, and she laughed, that beautiful wind chime laugh I'd come to treasure. "Now comes the hard part, actually making it work. Together." We pulled apart, but she kept one hand on my arm and I didn't mind at all. 6 months, she said. 6 months to prove that 500 years of division can be overcome. To show our peoples that they can trust each other, live together, build something new together. "No pressure," I said, echoing our earlier conversation at Blackstone Fortress. "None at all." Around us, people were beginning to approach. Supporters wanting to congratulate us, opponents wanting to argue, reporters wanting statements. But for just a moment longer, it was just the two of us standing in the Hall of Accords, having just changed the course of history. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for trusting me. For believing I could help with this. Thank you for being brave enough to try. She squeezed my arm once, then released me and turned to face the approaching crowd, the vampire queen once more, ready to begin the work of revolution. But she glanced back at me, and in her wine-dark eyes I saw everything we'd built together. Trust, partnership, friendship, hope. And I thought maybe this really could work. Maybe we really could save both our peoples. Maybe, just maybe, the world was about to change for the better. 6 months. We had 6 months to prove it. Let the work begin. 6 months sounds like a long time until you're trying to restructure 2 civilizations within that span. The work consumed us completely, 16-hour days, endless meetings, constant negotiations with both human and vampire factions who were either enthusiastically supportive or actively trying to sabotage everything we were building. Seraphine and I established our headquarters in a building right on the border between the human and vampire quarters of Valdris. Symbolism that wasn't lost on anyone. The first floor was our administrative center, where we coordinated with volunteers from both sides. The second floor housed our research team, human mages and vampire bloodcrafters working together to study the blight and develop potential countermeasures. The third floor was our residence. That last detail caused a scandal all by itself. The vampire queen and a human ambassador living under the same roof, even in separate apartments, was shocking to traditionalists on both sides. But Seraphine's position was firm. If we expected our peoples to live together, we needed to model that behavior ourselves. Let them talk, she said one evening about a month into our work, when I mentioned the rumors circulating about us. We were in her apartment, larger than mine, filled with books and maps and the accumulated possessions of 3 centuries, reviewing applications for our first pilot community. The more scandalous they find our living arrangements, the more they're thinking about the idea of humans and vampires coexisting. Even negative attention normalizes the concept. She had a point. And honestly, I'd stopped caring much about my reputation. I was working 18 hours a day trying to prevent the apocalypse. I didn't have energy left to worry about gossip. Our first pilot community was established in the small town of Ashford, about 50 miles from Valdris. It had been a human settlement on the edge of vampire territory, partially abandoned after a series of blight scares. We rebuilt it from the ground up, creating a community designed for integration from the start. The design itself was revolutionary. Buildings with both sun-accessible areas and shadowed spaces, blood donation centers that operated as community gathering spaces, schools where human and vampire children learned together. We recruited 50 families, 25 human, 25 vampire, all volunteers who believed in the unification and were willing to be pioneers. I'll never forget the day we officially opened Ashford. Seraphine and I stood at the town's entrance, watching as families moved in, humans and vampires greeting each other with a mixture of nervousness and hope. "This is it," Seraphine said quietly, her hand finding mine, a gesture that had become natural over the past month. "This is where we find out if we're visionaries or fools. Can't we be both?" She laughed, squeezed my hand, and together we walked into Ashford to welcome our pioneers. The first month was rough. There were incidents. A vampire who lost control and bit a human child, non-fatally but terrifyingly. A human family who tried to set up silver barriers around their home. Several cases of children bullying each other across species lines. Each incident could have destroyed the entire experiment, could have proven that integration was impossible. But something unexpected happened. The community itself responded. When the vampire who'd lost control was brought before the community council, half human, half vampire as specified in our treaty, it was other vampires who demanded accountability, who insisted on rehabilitation and strict monitoring. When the human family tried to set up barriers, it was their human neighbors who confronted them, who said that fear wouldn't be tolerated in Ashford. The children, surprisingly, adapted fastest. Within weeks, I saw human and vampire kids playing together, forming friendships that would have been unthinkable in the outside world. They were too young to carry the full weight of 500 years of hatred, and they were growing up in a place where cooperation was normal. "They're going to save us," Seraphine said one day, watching a mixed group of kids playing in Ashford Central Square. "Not us, not the politicians, not the old guard. These children, growing up without the prejudices we had to unlearn, they're the future of unification. She was right. And as word of Ashford's success spread, applications for additional pilot communities skyrocketed. By the third month, we'd established 5 more towns like Ashford, each one a small beacon of what was possible. But success brought its own problems. The more visible our pilot communities became, the more threatened the traditionalists felt. Anti-unification groups formed on both sides, holding protests, spreading propaganda, occasionally resorting to violence. The attack came on a cold night in the 4th month. I was in my apartment reviewing budget reports for our expanding program, when I heard the explosion. The building shook, alarms began screaming, and I could smell smoke. I ran into the hallway and found Seraphine already there, her wings spread in combat readiness. "Ground floor," she said. "Incendiary device. Could be either side. Both the anti-vampire faction and the vampire traditionalists have threatened attacks." We rushed downstairs to find the administrative center on fire, our staff evacuating in controlled chaos. The explosion had been relatively small, more of a warning than a real attempt to cause casualties, but the message was clear. Someone wanted us to stop. While the fire brigade worked to contain the blaze, Seraphine and I stood outside, watching smoke pour from the windows of the space we'd worked so hard to build. "They're scared," I said. "The extremists on both sides. They're seeing that this might actually work, and it terrifies them. So they lash out. Try to destroy what they can't control." Seraphine's jaw was set in a hard line. "We need to respond to this carefully. If we treat it as an act of war, we play into their hands. But if we ignore it, we look weak." An idea was forming in my mind. What if we rebuild together? Publicly. We call for volunteers from both communities, human and vampire, working side by side to repair the damage. We turn this attack into a demonstration of exactly what we're trying to build. She looked at me and I saw approval in her eyes. "That's brilliant. We don't just fix the building, we make the rebuilding itself a symbol." Within hours we put out the call for volunteers. I expected maybe a few dozen people to show up. Instead, hundreds came, humans and vampires alike, bringing tools and materials and willingness to work. They showed up not because we were paying them, but because they believed in what we were building. Over the next week, I watched our headquarters be rebuilt by the very community we were trying to create. Human carpenters worked alongside vampire stone shapers. Human engineers collaborated with vampire architects. They worked through the day and into the night, creating something stronger than what had been there before. And they talked. As they worked, they shared stories, compared experiences, found common ground. I watched a human grandmother bonding with a vampire elder over their shared frustration with younger generations not respecting tradition. I watched a young vampire warrior teaching combat techniques to human militia members, breaking down the fear through shared skill. This was the unification in action. Not the grand political structure we'd outlined in the treaty, but the simple human and vampire act of people working together toward a common goal. Seraphine saw it too. I found her one evening watching the reconstruction, tears on her face, the first time I'd seen her cry. "Are you all right?" I asked, concerned. "I'm fine. Better than fine." She wiped her eyes. I've spent so long being strong, being the queen who never shows weakness, never admits doubt. But seeing this, seeing what we've started," she gestured to the workers below. "Marcus, I think we're actually going to pull this off." I put my arm around her shoulders, another gesture that had become natural, and she leaned into me, her wing folding around us both. "We're going to pull this off," I agreed. "Not just us. Them. All of them. Everyone who's choosing to believe that the future can be different from the past." By the 5th month, the referendum was approaching, and the polls showed a country deeply divided. Roughly 40% supported unification, 40% opposed it, and 20% were undecided. Everything would come down to those undecided voters and how we reached them. Seraphine and I launched a final campaign, traveling to every major city in both human and vampire territories. We spoke at town halls, answered questions, addressed concerns. We brought families from Ashford and the other pilot communities to testify about their experiences. It was exhausting, grueling work. But slowly we watched the polls shift. 45% in favor. 48%. 50%. The night before the referendum, Seraphine and I returned to Valdres, to our partially rebuilt headquarters. We were too wired to sleep, too nervous about the vote, so we ended up on the roof watching the city lights and trying not to think about what would happen if we lost. If the referendum fails, Seraphine said quietly, the unification is dead. We'll have maybe a year before the blight reaches the borderlands, and both our peoples will face it divided, weakened, doomed. Then we'll make sure it doesn't fail. You can't guarantee that. No one can. No. But I can guarantee that we've given them the choice, shown them what's possible. The rest is up to them. I looked at her, at the woman who'd become my partner, my friend, the person I trusted most in the world. Win or lose tomorrow, Seraphine, you've changed things. You've changed me. You've proven that 500 years of hatred isn't stronger than the will to survive. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, she leaned over and rested her head on my shoulder. Her hair smelled like night-blooming flowers and old books and the ozone tang of thunderstorms, a scent I'd come to associate with hope. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. For believing in this crazy plan, for standing beside me through all of it, for seeing me as Seraphine rather than just the vampire queen. Thank you for trusting me. For showing me that the monsters we're taught to fear are just people trying to survive, same as us. We sat like that for a long time, watching the city, two people who'd started as enemies and become something far more important. Partners in revolution, friends in the fight for survival, two souls who'd found common ground in the most unlikely circumstances. Tomorrow, our peoples would vote on the future. But tonight, on this rooftop, we'd already won something precious. Proof that the divide could be bridged, that trust could be built, that hope was stronger than fear. Whatever happened next, no one could take that away from us. The referendum passed. Not overwhelmingly, 53% in favor, 47% against, but it passed. I learned the results at dawn, standing in the Grand Plaza alongside Seraphine and thousands of citizens who'd gathered to hear the announcement. When the numbers were read, the plaza erupted in a mixture of celebration and protest, joy and anger, hope and fear. But it passed. Seraphine and I didn't celebrate immediately. We stood on the platform watching the crowd, understanding that this vote was just the beginning. 47% of our combined populations had voted against unification, and those people didn't vanish because they'd lost. Their concerns were still valid, their fears still real. This is where the real work starts, Seraphine said, her hand finding mine in front of everyone, a public display of the partnership that would guide the unification forward. We have to prove to that 47% that they were wrong to be afraid. We have to build something so good, so effective at fighting the blight and protecting our peoples, that even our opponents eventually admit we made the right choice. No pressure, I said, and she laughed, that beautiful wind chime laugh that I'd heard evolve from a political tool to a genuine expression of joy over the past 6 months. None at all. The transition period was messy, chaotic, frustrating, and miraculous. Over the next year, we established a unified government with representatives from both sides, merged military forces under joint command, created the Oversight Council we designed in the treaty. The pilot communities like Ashford expanded, new mixed settlements were founded, and slowly, so slowly, the borders between human and vampire territories began to blur. The blight continued to spread, but now we fought it together. Human mages and vampire bloodcrafters developed combination techniques that neither could have created alone. Joint military forces held defensive lines that had been failing when each side fought separately. Research teams made breakthroughs in understanding the blight's properties, discoveries that brought us closer to not just containing it but maybe, someday, reversing it. Not everything went smoothly. There were setbacks, conflicts, moments when the whole unification seemed on the verge of collapse. But each time Seraphine and I were there, sometimes mediating, sometimes pushing, sometimes just being visible symbols of what we were building together. 5 years after the referendum, I stood in what had once been the Grand Plaza but was now called Unity Square, watching a ceremony that would have been unthinkable when I first arrived in Valdres. A joint graduation of the first combined military academy class, Human and vampire soldiers who'd trained together, bonded together, would serve together in the fight against the blight. Seraphine stood beside me as she always did now. We'd become inseparable over the years, our partnership evolving into something deeper than friendship but different from romance. A connection forged in revolution, tempered by shared struggle, stronger than any bond I'd known. "Do you remember," I said quietly as the graduates marched past, "that first night in your chambers? When you dismissed your guards and proposed this insanity? I remember thinking you'd refuse. That you'd run straight to your council and report me as a madwoman." She smiled, watching the mixed squad of human and vampire soldiers march in perfect formation. "I'm glad you were braver than that. I'm glad you were crazy enough to try." We were both crazy. Still are. She took my hand, a gesture so natural now that no one in the crowd even remarked on it. "But we were right, Marcus. Look at them. Look at what we've built." I looked. I saw humans and vampires standing side by side in the crowd, cheering for soldiers of both species. I saw children of both kinds playing together in the square, the generation that would grow up never knowing the old divisions. I saw the headquarters of the Unified Council, flying a new flag that incorporated symbols from both our people's histories. It wasn't perfect. The blight was still a threat, still spreading, still claiming territory in the far north. There were still pockets of resistance to the unification, still people on both sides who clung to old hatreds. The work of building this new civilization would continue for decades, maybe centuries. But we'd proven it was possible. We'd shown that 500 years of division could be overcome by two people willing to sit together without guards, to trust each other, to imagine a better future and fight like hell to make it real. "Your Majesty." Ambassador Thorne. We turned to see a reporter approaching, one of the new breed of journalists who covered both human and vampire issues without bias. "Can I get a statement about the graduation ceremony? About how it feels to see the unification's military integration complete?" Seraphine glanced at me and I nodded. We'd done so many of these interviews that we had a rhythm now. "It feels like a beginning," Seraphine said. 5 years ago these soldiers would have been enemies. Today they're comrades, united in defending all our people against a threat that doesn't care about our old divisions. That's what the unification was always about, not erasing our differences, but learning to see past them toward common goals. "And Ambassador Thorne," the reporter turned to me, "you were there from the start. Do you think the unification will succeed in stopping the blight?" I thought about Elena, about her belief in impossible things. About the choice I'd made to shake a vampire queen's hand in a room without guards. "I think we've given ourselves a fighting chance," I said. "Whether we succeed depends on every person in both our populations choosing, every day, to see each other as allies rather than enemies. The unification isn't something that was accomplished in a vote 5 years ago. It's something we're accomplishing, together, every single day." The reporter thanked us and moved on to interview the graduates. Seraphine and I stayed a while longer watching the ceremony, then slowly made our way back through Unity Square toward the council chambers. We had work to do. We always had work to do. But as we walked through the square, through the city we'd transformed together, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly. We were still fighting for survival, still facing the blight's advance, still struggling with the challenges of integration. But contentment, knowing that we were doing something that mattered, building something that would outlast us both. "Marcus," Seraphine said as we reached the council building, "I've been thinking about the future. About what comes next." "What about it?" "I'm 350 years old. Barring catastrophe, I'll live for centuries more. You..." She hesitated, and for the first time in a long time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. "You're human. In another 30 or 40 years you'll be gone. And I'll still be here, still leading, still fighting. But I'll be doing it without my partner." I'd thought about that too, late at night when I couldn't sleep. Thought about the fundamental inequality of our partnership, that she was effectively immortal and I was not. "Are you offering to turn me?" I asked carefully. "To make me vampire so we can continue this partnership forever? Would you want that?" I was quiet for a long moment, considering. The old me, the one who'd walked into her chambers 6 years ago, would have been horrified at the suggestion. But I wasn't that person anymore. No, I said finally. Not because I'm afraid of it, but because I think the unification needs to see that humans and vampires can work together as we are, without one side having to become the other. If I became vampire, it would suggest that humans aren't good enough as they are, that we have to transform to be worthy partners. I thought you'd say that. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. I'll miss you, Marcus Thorne. When your time comes, I'll miss you more than I've missed anyone in 3 centuries. I'll miss you too. But Seraphine, I took both her hands in mine, you trained me well. By the time I'm gone, there will be hundreds of people, human and vampire both, who can continue this work. You won't be alone. You'll never be alone again because we built something bigger than just our partnership. We did, didn't we? She looked back at the square, at the mixing crowds, at the banner of unification flying over the council chambers. We built a future. We gave them a chance at one. The rest is up to them. We climbed the steps into the council chambers together, ready for another day of building the impossible, fighting the darkness, proving that trust was stronger than fear and hope was stronger than hatred. No guards. No barriers. No walls between us. Just 2 people who'd changed